So hello, everyone. My name is Jenna Hamid, and I am the Programs Manager at Center for Book Arts. Thank you so much for joining us for this event with the curators of our summer exhibition, summer reading, and we also have two participants in the exhibition, poet Major Jackson and Jill Moser, who's the artist. So the exhibition is a series of works by contemporary artists who take creative approaches to the book, text, and language. I'm going to let the curators speak a bit more about that, but you can visit the exhibitions through September 19th, Monday through Saturday from 11 to 4 p.m. Actually 11 to 6, we changed our hours. We're now open later. So I'm gonna have Anne and Lindsay on the Zoom stage, and I first wanna briefly introduce both of them. Anne Tarantino is an artist, curator, and educator working across drawing, painting, installation, and site-specific works of art. The works have been exhibited widely in the US and overseas and has appeared in settings ranging from museums and galleries to botanical gardens and city streets. Lindsay Lanfried is a visual artist, curator, and advocate. Her work has been exhibited throughout the US and Germany with recent exhibitions at Space Gallery of Pittsburgh Cultural Trust, Millsaps College, Mississippi University, and many, many others. So without further ado, I'm gonna welcome Lindsay and Anne.
Thanks, Jenna. And hi, everyone. Thanks so much for coming. I wondered, Jenna, if we have that little video that you took of the show, or perhaps if that's not immediately accessible, we could look at it a little bit later too. I just thought maybe to frame it for everyone. And I'll just speak for a moment. Lindsay, please jump in at any time. Thanks to Jenna and to the Center for the opportunity to present the show, which traveled to the Center for Book Arts from Penn State, where Lindsay and I originated it. What feels like a long time ago now. We lost a year there to COVID. So we're delighted to get to share this new iteration with all of you. And thanks so much to Jill and Major as well for being part of it. These are some images that Jenna had taken, a little video here, just so we could do something of a walkthrough. And I think of the show as, the title is kind of this tongue-in-cheek take on, you think of summer reading that you might have been assigned in junior high, or a book that, all of the kids had to read before you go back to school, and this kind of reading as obligation, but also discovery. And we kind of wanted to turn that idea, explore the idea of reading. What does it mean to read? So if you are literally reading, or you're reading figuratively, or you might read a work, read an artwork in a particular way, and someone else might read it differently. So the work here, and here we're looking at some of the pieces we're going to be discussing tonight, all explores some of the various permutations of the verb to read.
Yeah, and I'll add, I think of this as having kind of multiple buckets it's a large group exhibition, as you can see. And in some of the instances, the artists are taking the written word in their readings of it as the material for the exhibition. In other instances, the books become raw matter that then gets reconfigured or repurposed. So for example, the pieces on the right here at the end of the video by Mary Ellen Bartley, she's collecting pulp fiction from the Strand bookstore and putting the book into her photography as these mock modernist grids. Other folks who start with book and printed matter in the exhibition would include like Skye Gilkerson, who is working with newspaper and print, or Joy Drury Cox, who has taken the fly leaves out of many, many books to construct her piece. So that working with the book as the material is definitely present. Where I see Jill And Major's work relating to the other artists in the show are folks who have an ongoing collaboration with writing, whether it's someone like the painting on the left here, you can see on the far side, it's yellow. That's a piece by Eric Denbrian, who in many ways paints kind of love letters or fan art to some of his favorite texts. But I think, when we'll discuss more tonight, there's a very different relationship between the text and the image in your collaboration, Jill and Major, that I look forward to speaking with you about. So while we begin talking about your work, we are going to pull up some images of the particular pieces in the show, and we'll be fortunate that Major is going to read them, which is really the best way to experience poetry, in my opinion. And I want to introduce you both, so I will read from your biographies to give folks a sense of who you are and where you've come from, in your careers. So Jill Moser is a New York-based artist, painting drawings, prints, and collages that explore the intersections of painting, writing, and the animated image. Mosher is a graduate of Brown and received the Brooklyn Museum's Max Beckman Scholarship. She was an associate director of material arts for the New York Department of Cultural Affairs and has been on the faculty at Princeton, VCU, SUNY New Paltz, and many more. As a very accomplished exhibiting artist, she's worked extensively with printmakers to investigate gestural indices and colors and remediates the connection between the handmade and the mechanical. So there's several editions and several actually writer-artist collaborations that she's participated with. And Major Jackson is the author of 5 books of poetry, including The Absurd Man, Roll Deep, Holding Company, Hoops, Leaving Saturn, which won the Cave Canem Poetry Prize for a first book of poems. His edited volumes include Best American Poetry, Renga for Obama, and the Library of America's County Cullen Collected Poems. He's a recipient of fellowships from the Fine Arts Work Center, the Guggenheim Foundation, National Endowment for the Arts, the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard, and has been awarded a Pushcart Prize. I could go on about you all, but it's embarrassing, right? I mean, I never like it when it happens to me. So anyway, I hope that gives everyone at least a little bit of intro to your practices, your works, and now perhaps we should take a look at them.
So I will read, but before I do, I want to thank Anne and Lindsay for including Jill and I's collaboration in the exhibition, and thanks to the Center for Book Arts. And we'll talk more about the poems, but I'll just read them and without much of a preface. This is titled Thinking, Double View of the Adirondacks as Reflected over Lake Champlain from Waterfront Park, which some of you may or may not know is located in Burlington, Vermont, right there. You see the water, you see the sky, and you see the Adirondack Mountains, quite beautiful. The mountains are at their theater again, each rigged, practicing an oration of scale and crest. And the sails, performing glides across the lake, complain for being outshadowed despite their gracious bows. 13 years in this state, what hasn't occurred? A cyclone in my spirit led to divorce. 4 books gave darkness an echo of control, my slurred hand finding steadiness by the prop of a page. And God, my children, whom I scarred, pray they forgive. My crimes felt mountainous, yet perspective came with distance, and like those peaks once keening beneath biting ice, then felt resurrection in a vestige of water, unfrozen, cascading and adding to the lake's depth. Such have I come to gauge my own screaming. The mast tipped so far, They appear to capsize, keeling over where every father is a boat on water. The wakes carry the memory of battles, and the Adirondacks hold their measure. I am a tributary of something greater. This next poem, Swiping Left in New York, a poem ending with a line by John Ashbery. What accounting did we perform on our feelings, which made all those convincing expressions of amore more like scattered spent balloons when the party has died down to a post-election speech and the loser shushes an injured crowd offering jump rope support for his opponent? Please drop the needle again. As so often happens, we are without a cement foundation or a caisson, and one of us is sitting by a red rotary phone playing "Time is on my side." Yes, it is. I hate courtships like I hate circulars, all that false advertisement just to get me in the door. Vintage phonographs are back in, and so too Sunday morning, that's when my eyes go. So too Sunday morning staticky intros with Bloody Marys. There were tuberous dahlias doing a number once in our gardens. They can only say something annually, unlike tubas, which though dormant in cases by humming refrigerators and cramped pre-wars in Manhattan, shine brassily to some silent march, some victory ahead. That's what we get for checking our debits and credits, a lukewarm ecosystem in our heads, plenty of doubts when we all know the world is one feverish jungle. And our profit loss reports, a single seething statement of our turpitude. We are only fabulous beasts after all. I had so much fun writing that one. Jill, do you want to talk about these two poems?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's fabulous to hear them again.
So I sent you 5 poems, as I recall.
Yes.
Why did you choose
yeah.
these 2?
Go ahead. You sent me more than 5 poems. You sent me a whole sheaf of poems, but maybe I should talk about how this originated first.
Good idea.
But anyways, fantastic to hear you read them. I know these poems so well, and it comes back to me. About 7 years ago, I think, Major and I were both visiting artists up at the Vermont Studio Center. And after I gave my presentation about my own work, which included collaborative work with the collaborations I've done with writers, including the other piece that's in the exhibition, a book I did with Charles Bernstein, Major and I talked about collaborating together. Major too had worked with visual artists. And then about 2 years later, I think, I was offered by the Southampton Literary Review to submit which comes out quarterly, I think, to submit a portfolio of my work. And since it was a literary review, it seemed the perfect opportunity to do a collaboration with Major and invite him to do it. So he was game. And fortunately, that fall or spring, I can't remember which season, he was teaching at NYU in the city, otherwise living in Vermont. So he was coming back and forth to the city on a regular basis. So we set this up. Oh, so you sent me a whole sheaf of poems to consider, new poems. And I picked, given the space I had to work with for the portfolio, I picked 5 poems. I think it was 5. 1, 2, 3, 4. Oh no, 6 poems. And so we began. Do you want me to talk? I can talk about the technique.
I'll add to that, going back to that quite beautiful encounter at the Vermont Studio Center. I just so admired your work. You were giving a presentation after dinner and talking about not going through your full career, but giving examples. And I thought it was so inspiring, and partially what caught my eye was there's a sophisticated simplicity to your art that feels spiritual at times, that feels like quite meditative, where there's both movement and action, and yet stillness. And I also, if I recall, you were not shy to work with color. And in that dark room, I remember, I think was it winter or fall? Yeah.
Deep winter.
Yeah. There was something about the relationship between the season and the colors that just made me giddy afterwards. And so I think we had a long conversation afterwards. So I was really excited to admire your work, to get the invitation to collaborate. It was and when I visit your studio, which was the next case, and I at that time I had been teaching 8 years, going back and forth between Vermont and New York in the fall, 1 day a week, to teach graduate students in the creative writing program. And normally my day would constitute reading poems, which is totally fine, like prepping my lecture. But what a wonderful kind of disruption to my day, or sometimes the end of the day, to discuss your work and try and figure out what we were going to do.
Yeah, and likewise, I mean, the opportunity to work with you was to really take me to places I hadn't gone in my work, and to come, I mean, for me to work with a writer is to get to sort of inhabit their work, and to try to find sort of the logic with which you work, and then somehow find equivalence in my own language. And that was, I mean, thank you for how you described my work. I think I felt an affinity with yours that way. It's musicality, it's both the sort of the fictive, the real, the play between what's sort of put in motion and what's discursive about your work is part of what I really love and feel connected to. And I think it's what we both tried to find in the process by which we were working, which was unique to both of us. I had come from print, doing a lot of printmaking, using this translucent material called Duralar, which you use to as almost like a photo plate to print with, so you can project through it. And it seemed the perfect way of making kind of filmic stages for your work in a way. And I wanted to create a form to work with where you could participate in the construction of the image, both with your language, but also to be constructing as well. So that was the collage nature of setting it up, so that we could sort of assemble these things together in a way. So the way we did it was that I worked on these translucent plastics, and then sort of responding to Major's poems. And then it's very DIY, on my computer in my studio, found the fonts he wanted to work with, and that were appropriate for each poem. And then we printed them on my printer with this sort of translucent paper. And then we kind of cut and paste and put them together or took them apart, right? And
yeah, I found that, and by the way, the Urban Renewal is, these particular poems are part of a kind of career-long project that will publish probably in the next, probably next couple years, but they are among probably 80 other poems. And this is the first time that I collaborated with an artist. There were some earlier Urban Renewal poems that were made into broadsides that I have in my collection, but I never worked with the artist directly. What I liked about that process that you're going to share with, I think you just shared, was that even though, so your work has that brushstroke, feels very dynamic, almost like you just raised it up. And I feel like the solidity of the stanzas had a kind of a, one experiences stasis when you hit a poem in a book. And with a work of art, there's movement, there's motion, there's gesture. And so to have those two overlay and try and figure out how it would look on the page felt like I was borrowing from your process in a way. And also it felt, of course it felt improvisatory, and as improvisatory as making the, as writing the poems.
yeah, because I remember, like, for Swiping Left, we decided on a diptych, right?
Right.
I mean, some of it had to do with the format of the publication, and we knew it was going to be pretty small, so we wanted things to be pretty vivid and readable. So this is a long poem, but I also think we wanted, as you wrote in the introduction to this whole portfolio, we wanted to keep things kind of in play, in the looking and the reading, and to keep that dynamic of looking and reading in play and discursive. So for this one, I remember moving these, as you were just describing, moving these stanzas around so that because of the way we constructed this, we could physically together move things and see things, which everybody knows is the only way you can know something. So yeah, so I remember that specifically on this. And then of course, double view of the Adirondacks, there was always this kind of, there was the shifting staging of the sides, which is very much, I mean, for me, it was very much like the nature of that poem.
Right. The one of the words you mentioned, recalls from legibility, recalls to me how in previous collaborations, particularly with musicians, it's easy for the language to be just a mere element and for the words to kind of get drowned out by the music or the instruments or the rhythm. So there's a level of balance that has to be achieved where both arts are kind of honoring each other and creating space. I forgot about the question of legibility. And in fact, some part of me wanted the words to kind of hide. Early on, I wanted the words to kind of hide behind the art. But of course, the readers of Southampton Review needs to, they need to be able to kind of cognitively make that relationship between your art and the words. I think we also talked about avoiding literal, early on in early conversations, kind of early translations of this poem, of the poems, but creating something that was kind of more dynamic than that kind of one-to-one correspondence between one art and another.
Right, and your work, your writing, you really do explore imagery in a very beautiful way, which I was very conscious of avoiding. I wanted to avoid being an illustration of what you were writing.
So boring, just so boring.
Well, it's just too, I didn't want to be, as we said, we didn't want to be literal. We didn't want to be direct. So, and and it's certainly what, why I chose the kind of sort of patternation of gesture. I mean, at this point, I mean, I've been deeply involved in gesture, and I love it as a way of, as a kind of description that for me is something between sort of language and performance. And because it's both sort of past and present, it's indexical and it's presently descriptive. So it seemed, but what you sort of pushed me to do was to work more like in swiping left, with a sort of patternation, a more rhythmic kind of field, so that there wouldn't be a kind of direct correspondence, so that it would keep everything kind of inhabiting each other in a way. Yeah. So I do think I was creating a kind of place for your work, and you too, in the construction of the stanzas. Yeah. So, and also I think we were very conscious of the fact that people would be holding this in their hands, and I mean, for me, I mean, you think of this all the time about your poems, but for me, people don't hold my work generally. Mm-hmm. So that the sort of tangibility of the image, the intimacy of it, the sense of reading an image,
Were you worried about, I know you've worked with other poets before, but were you worried about something being lost in translation with that scale, that reduction of scale?
Well, it wasn't ideal. And I fought with the art director over the fonts that she used, but not the fonts in the pieces that we did, but the heading fonts. But ideally, at some point, I would love to see these made into larger prints, because they're all set up to do that, both with letterpress and and lithography. So someday, no, but I was, it's always interesting to work with the limitations you're given.
Yeah, right.
It's challenging. Yeah. And I love the opportunity to be able to publish. Sorry?
I think Anne and Lindsay had some questions for her.
Yeah, I can jump in. It's related to what you both are talking about. In other collaborations I've seen of Jill's with poets, they arrive as a lithograph, or they arrive as a hand-painted volume. Sort of the form is less improvisational, at least at the end. And what I've loved about the pieces that we have in the summer reading exhibition, which you stated, Jill, they have this really DIY feeling. Like the evidence of all of the decisions is still there, and that you can see the edges of things. You can tell that they were once shifted, that they were fixed, and that there's a real back and forth in them. And to the point about illustration, oftentimes these collaborations, at least in the past, have had a real call and response feel. When I think about folks from the Ashcan School, or even Judy Chicago's collaborations with poets, there is like a you act and I act, and you act and I act. This to me has such more of almost the feeling of a dance, where it's like, because there's a reaction, there's an equal and opposite reaction. This thing pushed, this thing pulls, and that rhythm is really very present in the work. And so thinking about that, I am interested to hear, where you found rules or parameters, like what was the constraint? Of course, it was that it was going to be digitally printed. It was probably going to be small, but even like a violinist can do so much with a very particular scale. Like, where did you recognize what the constraints in the collaboration might be?
Well, I guess I had my big concern, as always, is because I've also worked with film directors and producers, and whenever my poems have been adapted, there's a literalness to it, and that's something that I wanted to kind of avoid. So I believe we talked about that as already. The constraints, I also had in mind, I'm a huge fan of kind of word and image art, and I had a whole history of it behind me that was kind of informing which poems I was going to send Jill. And some of the poems are quite accessible, but I'm thinking about Ashbery and Franco Harris' relationship with artists and the whimsicality of it. And I think that's something that knowing that Jill is a New York-based artist, I wanted to maybe do a nod to that. So but I could not help to see what she would do with a poem like Thinking of Frost or Double View of the Adirondacks, which is very kind of literal and accessible. There's a level of speed in poems that are driven by association. And when I think of Jill's work, it's less about pattern and more about that kind of quick flash speed. And so I was thinking about that, and that's what informed me to give her those poems. But I'm curious to hear how Jill would answer that.
I don't know. I mean, I got to choose the poems I wanted to work with, and there's some poems that just floored me, and one in particular that we didn't put in the show, called, I've talked to Major about this a lot, but called Theory of the Origin of Prophecy. Or no, is it called? Yeah, A Theory on the Origin of Prophecy. Which is so moving to me that I almost was without imagery for it. I mean, I just wanted the kind of grace and depth of the poem in the way I painted it. I don't know, limitations really came from the form in which it was going to be presented, and certain frustrations, of course, but it was an opportunity too to present the work together, at a larger audience, and to have it printed. I don't know. I mean, each project that I enter into with a collaborator, because I've done it also with people who, other painters and architects and other kinds of people, but I think I always am looking for both what's challenging about the project and also what is the sort of, the common ground, a place that we can both sort of play in. And I think that's the spirit in which I want the work to kind of emerge as too. What I learned, actually, one of the things that I did learn from the collaboration with Major that I have brought to the last project I did with the poet Anna Maria Hong, which resulted in a book, was during COVID, where I really wanted to see if I could even push, Lindsay, what you were picking up on, which is this, the more sort of dialogic part of a collaboration where you're really working together. We ended up calling our collaboration of Anna Maria's and mine a volley, because it was this deliberate back and forth, so that I wasn't just responding to the poems. I mean, I too, like Major, was bred on Franco Harris, In Memory of My Feelings, and Guston and Clark Coleridge's collaborations, and loving that work and always wanting the opportunity to do that. And you do have a sense from like Guston's collaborations with Clark Coleridge that they are very much in the same room talking to each other. you know, he's drawing, he's talking, he's, you know, smoking, he's drinking, you know, they're doing it all together. That's, you know, Major and I talked about that a lot, how we could really do that. And we did a fair amount of drinking and moving things around. Because actually what we didn't talk about was that half of the time we had to meet at a bar near NYU. A wine bar that gave us, we had the whole place to ourselves.
That's right. We
Spread out
laid out.
Yeah.
One of the questions that we had for you was about process, and which of course, I think you answered all of our questions, actually anticipated everything we wanted to know, but I was really struck, and this relates back to Lindsay's point too, about how very collaborative this collaboration seems to be, and kind of fearless in a way, you know, sort of this kind of transfer of energy, or just willingness to let something perhaps become something else in someone's hand, which I find really exciting. Just as a note, you know, as a visual artist myself too, it's funny, if you would ask me to describe what I guess the process was, I probably would have said something really different. And that's something, you know, I wouldn't have known. That's something that I sometimes say to my students, I don't want to know how you made it, you know, like you don't, like that's the mystery or the secret of it. So that was really fun to hear you talk about it and realize that that was kind of a new world, a new frontier.
Huh. That's interesting. Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, like sort of simultaneously, you know, Lindsay was saying kind of seeing the edges and kind of feeling the marks, but also like there's sort of a quiet and an elegance, I think, that kind of sits alongside that quality.
Yeah, I can add that you've described your poems, Major, a couple times as like that around next is being literal, and this one is being literal. They're very full of images, but they almost, to me, also have weather and light and atmosphere. Like there's a space in between things that isn't literal. And I find that that's a bit like your gestures too, Jill, where they might be indexical, but they're also a document, and they're also, you know, present, future tense. And that is really, you know, a delight to be around. So I hope everybody can go see them, of course. But yeah, I guess I'm not getting to a question, but the question that I'm pointing at is, where do you see light or atmosphere, either, you know, about your work or about the other person's work informing?
Can I add color to that too?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, all those things are key. I guess what I was trying to describe is how, and it all came back to me in reading them again and Major reading them. And actually, Major reading them is essential to it. And that's why on my website, when I have the images of the work, I actually have a reading of Major. I mean, he's reading each poem. But yes, in the process of working to get away from the literal, I would study the poems for their atmosphere, for their light, I would let that kind of inform what I was doing. I mean, that's what informed them more than me saying, oh, he's talking about a bad date, or he's talking about, you know, whatever, you know. So I mean, I didn't even know what swiping left meant, since I'm an old
That's right.
lady.
You didn't know that. That's right.
So I actually did that literally. I was like, okay, I'll just keep swiping left. Yeah, so yes, those are key. And as Anne was asking, I mean, color is also part of that, response completely. Like in swiping left, to me, it seemed like he's playing with all of these kind of both arcane and current, you know, events and things. And so I chose to work with, you know, a kind of real fictive green, and then a very, you know, kind of like blood red, and then, and then of course the action of the gesture has, for me, always has, it is indexical, so it does carry the way in which it's made, which is a handmade thing. It has a part of what it holds is the action in which it was made. So that action has a certain quality. And so, yeah. So, it's either soft or hard or fast or slow or, yeah. Yeah.
Well, I often ask artists what their, dream project would be. It's the curator and their dream project is the curator in me saying, like, if you could do any show, if it could be anywhere, it could be anything. But I guess in this context, I'll probably ask, do you have, either of you, dream collaborations? Like, and it can be,
yeah,
impossible ones. Those ones are
right.
probably.
Are you going to write the grant?
Well, for the impossible ones, yeah.
I would actually I'd like to collaborate with Major again.
I was just thinking that.
We were just talking about this when we were talking before. I think it would be interesting to revisit. I mean, Major just published this wonderful book of poems, The Absurd Man, and of which actually Double View is in here.
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
Revised a little.
But I was reading these before we talked today, and I was thinking, I would love to work with some of these. So my voice has changed a lot too. So it would be very, I would really love to do that. Also, I think I keep pushing my collaborations to be more collaborative. And so I think that's what my sort of, we're always doing that in our work, right? Trying to get to the next place beyond where we've been. So I think, that's ideally what I would like, is to find a really, kind of nonstop interactive collaborative thing. And maybe it's more performance and spoken word or something. I don't know, I'm not a performance artist, but something like that. Yeah.
That's funny. I was going in the opposite direction. Part of what I enjoyed about our work was that it was far more physical for me. Normally, I'm in my room. I'm in front of my computer. I'm not in a space like a studio in Queen City.
That. Yeah.
And I was, I guess for me, something that replicates that and that has my body a little bit more involved, or maybe working with a printmaker, something that gets me in a studio and out of my kind of home office, something along those lines. I gave a reading in South Beach, and there was a muralist, unbeknownst to me, who nearby he had been commissioned by this hotel to do a mural in the alley, and he incorporated some of the images that I had in the poems, and they sent it to me afterwards. And I wish I knew in advance, because I would have loved to have kind of gotten on the scaffold with them. And, so that's what I mean. Like I'm not an artist, but if someone would let me into their process that way, I feel like I would grow as a writer.
That's so interesting.
Well, I mean, the last collaboration I did with Anna Maria, it was really, we were actually working with elements of our work. So it would be, I think that is possible to do that kind of thing, where you're not working with finished pieces so much as you're working with, she would send me lines of poems. So I can see how we could do that.
Well, funny enough, that back and forth, I remember some years ago, back in the late 90s, collaborating with a composer and a photographer, and we were to replicate Vivaldi's Four Seasons, creating a Philadelphia Four Seasons. And I wrote the poem, and we met once, that was it. You know, I wrote the poem, the composer wrote a wonderful, beautiful piece, and then it sent it to the photographer, and then a producer pulled together this. And there was something about that handing off that felt so not empty to me. I was happy that the person came along and pulled these elements together, but our kind of like conversation, like that felt very natural and very kind of, it fed me. And I don't think I've said it in those ways. It felt me. Not that I was depleted from teaching graduate students at the end of the day, but it was something invigorating about finding the overlaps, literal and figurative, about improvising. Font, like I was just looking at it again, I was like, did we really put that whole poem in caps? Like, why did we do that?
Yeah. Okay, yes, we'll do it again. Stay tuned.
Well, Lindsay and I also wanted to give our guests an opportunity to ask a question. If anyone would like to pose a question or put it in the chat, please feel free. Unless there's something else, Lindsay, you wanted to ask or comment upon.
What was can I ask a question? What was your kind of through line vision? I really liked how you were talking about reading read widely, literal figure, but was there any elements in each, either texture, or you mentioned light or color, that you feel pull it together, and what informed where you place the works in the gallery?
Yeah, that's such a great question. Maybe we kind of answer that together, Lindsay. We probably have allied but distinct things to say, I would imagine.
Sure. I remember when Anne and I were looking at the collection from the Urban Renewal collaboration, and we knew we would have to select down because of the size of the exhibition space. We were thinking through both, what was talked about in the text and also what was represented gesturally as like detectives. Like, is there a season here? Like, which one of these is, more has a sense of what it is like to be with a book? And I think about the Swiping Left in New York grabbed me right away because it's the only piece in the show that makes a literal reference to a phone, and that is not to be overlooked in how we experience reading almost exclusively. Or I look at my kids who read only on a laptop, and folks who write only, and maybe that is kind of a superficial connection, but it was one that grabbed me right away and made me come back to that poem multiple times.
We have a question in the chat that we'll answer, David, or speak to in just a moment. I wanted to just briefly add to Major's question that I was surprised, Lindsay, and we never really talked about this that much, but how much I found myself frequently in looking at the work or selecting the work for the exhibition. We came back to abstraction. There was, kind of fields of color, or the fly leaves, which kind of became this kind of modernist grid in a way, to even Brianne Trammell's kind of stack of colorful sort of book stand-ins, that there, and I think this speaks to reading too, kind of the grid, the rectangle, and these kind of fields or swaths of color, and thinking about the relationship of that to a field of letters or words.
It's really admirable what you guys did, because it's such a fantastic range of how artists have engaged with writers and the book form, and notions of reading, and it's great. I can't wait to see the catalog, which also looks
Yes.
great.
Yes, it sounds like it's going to be available shortly, right? Jenna said should be out.
Available now, actually.
Available now. Okay. David, do you want to ask your question yourself? I don't need to read it for you. We would love to hear you.
I'm happy to. So this has been great, and as is the exhibition, and so many thanks, and for answering most of the questions that I had. But I was curious if you might build on some of the things you talked about in terms of how you think about sort of the experience for the reader of the work, and particularly, and this comes up a lot with sort of poetry and visual art, the sort of difference in time between the time one spends sort of reading the text, versus looking at the image and potentially going back and forth, and maybe even to build on that, how that changes between reading it in the magazine that it appeared in, framed on a wall, or I think ideally looking at the image while it's being read, aloud as we got to do at the start. So sort of a convoluted set of questions, but sort of coming back to kind of the reader's experience.
Thanks, David. One of the, not a big concern, but the work has a graphic quality to it, and I think we're conditioned to kind of see an image and register it and then kind of move on, like the brain does that quick processing. The poem demands that you get close to it, that you kind of sit with it and keep returning to it. And so what was exciting for me about collaborating with Jill, particularly these sets of poems, was that I was terribly okay if the reading was brief and quick and it registered. I see her use of green, her red, her black. Oh, I see the title. Ashbury carries a lot of history and references, but something else is happening in the poem. And I think what's great about the journal is that someone can come back to it, whereas with the gallery, they're kind of walking through, registering, probably, I forgot the amount of time I heard that someone spends looking at a work of art on the wall. So the privilege of being in a journal is that they can keep coming back to that page and hopefully being rewarded, and a deepening of a relationship with the work can happen through multiple readings and maybe even changes. Like you said, something changes inside them, but also in how they're understanding our collaboration or our conversation. That's the hope. What do you think, Jill?
Yeah, no, I think it's a really interesting question, and it's something we think about a lot, because people don't, as there is people do spend very limited time looking at works of art in museums. We've noticed in museums, they take their iPhone pictures and they move on, but people are more arrested by videos because they have a duration. So to set up that kind of durational viewing and reading it was also part of the challenge of doing this, I think. I think we were sort of aware of that as we were constructing the image, the placement of image and text, and to suspend a kind of the time of reading, to keep it slow and to keep it moving. Yeah, but it's a really good question. And I am curious, the whole idea of whether one reads, as Major was saying, being able to revisit in a book form that work versus reading. Ideally, I would like to be able to hear Major reading the poem, the image while you're in the gallery. I mean, which is why on my website I have that, because I do think it suspends a kind of looking, keeps you looking as you're reading, but I don't really know.
I can ask one follow-up. This one's for Major, since I think we've all at some point mentioned how powerful it was for us to hear you read with the image. For you, what role does reading versus writing play in your work?
I ran a reading series in Philadelphia at the Painted Bride Art Center, and I am digitizing a bunch of cassettes that I inherited from there, as well as other readings that I have. And how gorgeous to kind of go back in time, like hear these voices. I also have a bunch of Cadman tapes that has, people like Auden and William Carlos Williams, and that's a whole nother time travel. And I'm trying to put together a audio piece around this. But in terms of my process, my form of revision is reading out loud to myself, and I'm trying to hear, what the artist sees, which is, where's the next stroke? What part of the canvas are you going to move towards? So when I read, there's a propulsiveness that happens when you read out a poem. There's a certain cadence you can get into, and it's almost like the words are calling back to you or calling other language around it. So my hope is, even though it comes off maybe in a recording as a seamlessness, my hope is that the act of searching for that language is embedded in the listening itself. The surprise that the surprise that we experience when a poem shifts in images or shifts in thought is part of the poem coming into being. And that's what I'm hoping that a reader hears when they hear me reading, is those kind of, what we call in poetry, caesura. I just read, it's also a term in music too, but those silences are so embedded with wonder and curiosity and searching. And so it's really crucial beyond just reading it on the page. That's why I have my students memorize poems. And my hope is that when people read poems, they're not reading quietly to themselves, but they're reading the poem out loud.
Yeah.
You're muted, Anne. Yeah, I think you just said something.
Thanks. Yeah, I did. I said I need to take your class.
Oh.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Only if I could take yours.
Right. We'll trade.
Would you call that the constructive logic of a poem?
Yeah. Yeah, I would. Because each poem has its own rationale, its own kind of, which is connected to the music too. It is constructed. It's a kind of orchestration. This is why we love improvisation, because on the surface, it has that kind of coming into being on the spot, but that moment falls within a larger kind of structure. And
yeah.
Sometimes it's image driven, sometimes it's the language is driven by music, but yeah, constructed logic is a great phrase for it.
Because I'm fascinated by that in all forms and in all mediums and in all disciplines. And I think that's the thing that I'm sort of I'm always plumbing when I look at somebody else's work. And certainly, with the people I collaborate with. I mean, it's the thing I try to find the commonality with. I mean, or find a parallel way of voicing and working, because it's the thing that does drive I mean, I love the way you described the way you make poems, because it's very much like how you make a painting, or how I make a painting. Yeah.
This seems like maybe a natural point for us to conclude our conversation. If there's any other questions, can chat them now, but I do want to take another moment again to thank the Center for the Book Arts, all the folks who worked on the design and the production of the catalog, which is itself a sculptural marvel that imitates the form of a book and is at times legible and at times illegible, and it's definitely worth experiencing. And thank you to Jenna, and good luck, Jenna, on all your
Yes,
future endeavors.
Mhm.
And thank you also, of course, to Jill and Mosher for spending time with us tonight and for lending your work to the exhibition. So
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone, and thanks
Yes,
for your
thanks
kind
for coming.
words. I just put a link to the catalog.
Oh, great.
Yeah, the artists should get a copy when they get their artwork back, but it's also available for sale in our bookshop.
Great.
Right. Thank you all.